Alright, this is my second recording on Thucydides' text, The Peloponnesian War, for my Technology and Nihilism series. And my first recording on the text was so successful, in fact, it's the most successful recording I've ever done, that I want to follow it up here with something that I hope you're going to enjoy just as much, if not more. And so in order to do that, I have to assume that you've already listened to the previous recording on Thucydides. And just as an all too brief recap, the only thing I covered in that first recording, which was almost 4 hours, was what's known as the archaeology of the text. And that's just a fancy way of saying the first roughly 19 to 20 passages. But what is so significant about that portion of the text is that Thucydides, in his own name, is doing all the talking. And the reason that that's so significant is that that is about to radically change, because the rest of the entire text is Thucydides providing speeches of the people from the Peloponnesian War. And what we're going to find out in this recording is just how significant that is for the themes of the entirety of the text that I already brought out in the first recording. Now I'm going to pick up where I left off in the previous recording, which is to say, with the end of the archaeology, because we're going to see precisely how that ending segues directly into the topic of this recording. But before I do that, I need to say a thing or two about just a few things from the archaeology that are going to be especially important for this discussion, namely what seems to be Thucydides' critique of the poets in general and Homer in particular, and how he understands himself in contrast to them, because it's going to be precisely the poets and Homer in particular that are going to resurface in an absolutely amazing way in Pericles' funeral oration, which, as we're going to see, has everything to do with the role of this thing called technology as it shows itself, and thematically so, in the teaching of Thucydides' entire text. And so to begin with, Thucydides' apparent critique of the poets, and Homer in particular, begins in paragraph 9. And this is what Thucydides says there. In my view, Agamemnon was able to assemble his expeditionary force more because he was the most powerful figure of his day than because the suitors of Helen, whom he was leading, were bound by oaths of loyalty to Tyndareus. Okay, full stop. So much for Helen of Troy, because according to Thucydides, it was simply a matter of Agamemnon's power. In continuing, what he says is that, in my view then, Agamemnon, with the combination of this inheritance and his superior naval strength, was able to put together and launch this expedition less by goodwill than by the fear that he inspired. Okay, and so just so that we're perfectly clear about this, it is not Helen of Troy, which is to say it's not the beautiful, and it's also not honor. And remember, oaths are always made in the name of the gods. So it's not the beautiful, it's not honor, and apparently it's also nothing to do with the divine that motivated the Trojan War. No, in fact, it was just an issue of power, and more specifically, the fear that power inspires. And just continuing there in that paragraph, Thucydides says, "For he evidently came with the largest contingent of ships himself, and in addition, he supplied the Arcadians with theirs, as Homer has stated clearly. If he, in other words, if Homer, constitutes sufficient evidence. And in his account of the handing down of the royal scepter, he further says that Agamemnon was lord over many islands and the whole of Argos." So the poets, and in particular the poet, Homer, can apparently be questioned. And again, that is going to resurface amazingly in Pericles' speech. But just finishing off that paragraph 9 there, Thucydides continues by saying, being based on the mainland, Agamemnon would not have held power over any islands except local offshore ones, which would not have been many, unless he possessed a significant navy. And it is on this expedition that we must base our assumptions about what earlier expeditions were like. So Homer is Thucydides' standard of measure for the earliest of Greek greatness. In other words, Homer provides Thucydides with that by which progress or decline in greatness is to be measured. So if we truly want to know what a golden era of heroes looks like versus an over-exaggerated account of barbarism lacking true greatness, what Thucydides is telling us is that we must look at ourselves now and compare ourselves to that which we find in Homer. And just as a quick reminder of what I went into great detail in the first recording, the significance of the Navy is everything for this thing that we refer to as technology, and which shows itself in Thucydides as progress in techne, which is to say innovation in the arts, and most especially in the art of shipbuilding, which is to say the building up and the advancement in the building up of navies, because it represents the capacity of and the extent to which the mind of man can exert control on and possibly even mastery over the sea, which is itself exemplary of that which is always in motion. And then in paragraph 10, Thucydides says the following: Now, just because Mycenae was a small place, or because some other township of that period does not now seem to amount to much, that's not a valid reason to doubt the size of the joint force, as reported by the poets and as traditionally accepted. So again, Thucydides is bringing to the forefront of the discussion not simply the importance of the poets for the handing down of the tradition, but he's also bringing to the surface the questionable nature in which that poetic handing down of tradition should be examined. And he immediately underscores that in the paragraph by saying the following: For just suppose the city of Sparta were wiped out, and all that were left were its shrines and the foundations of its buildings. I think that years later, future generations would find it hard to believe that its power matched up to its reputation. Yet, in fact, the Spartans occupied 2/5 of the Peloponnese and are leaders of the whole of it, as well as of many allies beyond it. Nevertheless, because they are not united in one city and have no lavish shrines or public buildings, but instead live in village settlements in the traditional Greek manner, they would be underestimated. On the other hand, if the Athenians were to suffer the same fate, they would be thought twice as powerful as they actually are, just on the evidence of what one can see. Now, it's worth belaboring what Thucydides is doing here. He is projecting himself generations into the future and looking back as if both Sparta and Athens are no more. And what we can say of this is that Thucydides takes as a premise the fact that all things that come into being perish away. And that's one of the deeper aspects of the role of motion, kinesis, in the archaeology itself. And what I mean by that is Thucydides' unstated but discernible principle throughout all of the archaeology of the perishability of all things. And it's precisely on that premise of the perishability of all things, which is to say the ceaselessness of motion writ large, that Thucydides is able to draw his conclusions here, which again seem to be a critique of the poets, and Homer in particular. And let's clarify that even further. What is being said here, what we are witnessing, is that Thucydides is making the claim that we simply cannot see the truth of things, and the human things in particular, unless we see them in motion. In fact, war itself is a subset of motion from the very opening paragraph of the text, because remember there that Thucydides first spoke about the war, and then he switched to speaking about the war as itself a motion, a kinesis. And just continuing a little further there in paragraph 10, Thucydides says, One should therefore keep an open mind and not judge cities by their appearance, rather than by their actual power. And one should accept that the Trojan expedition was the greatest of any up to that time, but smaller than modern ones, assuming again that we can trust Homer's account here too, which as a poet he may well have exaggerated for effect. Okay, again, full stop. There's much more to it, as I bring out in the first recording at great length, but what we can say, based just on this critique of the poets, and Homer in particular, is this: The ancients, our knowledge of which is traditionally accepted as handed down by the poets, and Homer in particular, they first and foremost lacked knowledge. Remember, it is absolutely not, at least according to Thucydides, Helen that motivated the Trojan War. So the ancients lacked understanding. And further, and as a result of their lack of understanding, they lacked power. And so the issue, or we could say the question of the poets, and of Homer in particular, in Thucydides, is the question of true understanding and the question of true power. And we're only able to gain knowledge into the truth of those things by seeing the human things in motion. And most exemplary of the human things are the cities, Sparta and Athens. Accordingly, to truly understand the nature of politics, you have to see cities in motion. And it's that right there, in other words, the need to see cities in motion in order to truly understand politics, that places Thucydides in juxtaposition with the so-called best cities in speech, and in particular, Plato's Republic on the one hand and Aristotle's Politics on the other. Consider, for instance, the Republic. Plato's Socrates does not show us what the best city in speech looks like in motion. This happens in the Timaeus, but there it is not Plato's Socrates who puts it in motion. Plato hands that off to Critias. And not only is Critias' speech there incomplete, it breaks off, but Plato's Socrates there never says anything about that city in motion. But let me clarify what I mean by that, because it is so important. The question of needing to see the best city in speech that Socrates provides in the Republic in motion, Plato makes the need for that question and its associated need for a solution very explicit to us in the Timaeus. However, he does not have Socrates place the best city in speech from the Republic in motion. Plato hands the task of providing the best city in speech in motion to Critias. And what Critias provides for us is an account of the ancient Athenians being invaded by the ancient Atlanteans. That's where we get the story of Atlantis from. And so the best city in speech that is put into motion by way of war, according to Critias, is a very ancient Athens. But that's extremely problematic because not only is Critias' speech incomplete, he gets cut off and the speech is never completed, but also in addition to the incompleteness of Critias' speech, Socrates remains silent. He never says anything. And the deep problem with Socrates' silence is that it could go in one of two directions. Either he's simply and implicitly agreeing with it, or he's remaining silent precisely because he's in great disagreement with it. And the best example of something like that we can see in our own lives, because very often the strongest form of disagreement that someone can show towards us, on anything really, is by them having absolutely nothing to say in response to us, or maybe even ignoring us. But again, it could go either way. We don't know. That is never provided to us in anything of Plato by Socrates. And so in this respect, we can say that Plato leaves us hanging. And by that, what I mean is that he makes the need for the question, in other words, a need for an answer to the question of the best city in speech placed in motion, explicit. He makes us aware of it. But the answer to that question in the Platonic dialogues remains indeterminate, because it means that we would have to either place Critias' speech or Timaeus' speech as the completion to the speech that Socrates gives in the Republic about the best city in speech. And making that work, in other words, making some kind of synthesis of those speeches non-contradictory, that is a huge problem for a whole host of reasons. And that's only one of the enormous problems that is involved in trying to synthesize Socrates' logos of the best city in speech in the Republic, in other words, the logos for Calliope, in harmony or synthesized with either the incomplete best city in speech in motion of Critias, in other words, the ancient Athenians, or the logos of the cosmos itself by Timaeus. But that being said, I go into detail about that problem in my series on Plato's laws. But for us right now, turning back to Thucydides, what we have is that Thucydides places the best city in speech in motion. In other words, the classical Athens of Thucydides at war with the rest of the Peloponnese, but in particular at war with Sparta. And we have to belabor this point because it speaks to what Thucydides is going to subsequently tell us his text, in other words, the Peloponnesian War, should be understood as. And what I mean by that is that it is not, emphatically not, mere history. In fact, the word history is not even in the title, as I explained in great detail in the first recording. But because of how in the 19th century, the study of history becomes its own field. In fact, prior to the 19th century, history was understood as a subfield of the broader study, the more noble study of rhetoric. But because we have all become so obsessed with history, and not simply history, but the scientific study of history, Thucydides' text gets referred to as the history of the Peloponnesian War, which it is not, again, as I described in great detail in the first recording. And Thucydides himself is understood as a kind of proto or amateurish historian. And so he's in no way taught as a kind of deep thinker on anything. And the devastating consequence of that for us is that Thucydides is not seen to be the alternative to the Platonic and the Aristotelian tradition, or what I have just been hinting at regarding the relationship of Thucydides to Plato. Instead, what is thought to be found in Thucydides' text, The Peloponnesian War, would be a kind of summary along the following lines. A democratic political order, in other words, Athens, becomes the leader of an allied confederation of other Greek states in order to defend their freedom and independence from an Eastern despotism, that's to say Persia. And Athens, leading the allied confederation, becomes dominant mainly because the other Greek states don't want to spend their money on troops and ships. And so Athens, taking the lead in defending all of Greece from Persia, begins receiving resistance from the other Greek states of the allied confederation. And in resisting the dominance of Athens, those other Greek states begin to refer to Athens as a tyranny over them. And in finally defeating Persia, the allied confederacy of all the Greek states, which is to say the liberators of all of Greece at large from the tyranny of Persia, Athens ends up being hated by nearly all of their former allies. And so it's that mere historical account that we find in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War that gets taken to be understood as the entirety of Thucydides' account given in the Peloponnesian War. And what I'm suggesting is that it is far richer and much more interesting than that, because Thucydides himself is a first-rate thinker in his own right next to Plato and Aristotle. And in fact, Thucydides is offering an alternative to what we find in Plato and Aristotle. And just as a first cut, what that alternative consists in is that Thucydides provides what he thinks the best city in speech is, which is to say classical or Periclean Athens, the Athens of art, innovation, of technology. And he shows it to us in motion, which is to say at war. And so it's when you begin to see Thucydides in that light that you recognize there is so much more going on and worthy of our study in Thucydides than what we're all too often mistakenly led to believe is in Thucydides by historians. In other words, Thucydides belongs right there on the shelf with Plato, with Aristotle, with all of Greek tragedy, and emphatically not on the shelf of something like history books of ancient Greece or something like that. And that's just a first cut at just how deep Thucydides can be once we begin to take a much more serious, focused, and very slow and patient reading of the Peloponnesian War. And we can say even more than that, because what's at issue is the status of origins or beginnings. Remember, in Plato's Republic, the first city that Socrates founds, whether he's being ironic or not, it's said to be good, healthy. It's only after Glaucon demands his relishes that the city is thrown out of balance because of the need for techne, and we could even say for knowledge, episteme, in order to satisfy those desires. That's what makes the city feverish. And Thucydides' archaeology, which we could literally translate as the logos of origins or beginnings, would seem to be exactly the opposite of that. Remember, Thucydides presents the rise of Greekness from out of barbarism. In other words, origins or beginnings in Thucydides are imperfect. And that's just another way of phrasing what we already mentioned was the question of poetry in the archaeology. The ancients were weak and they lacked true understanding. The archaeology is the story of the rise of true understanding and true power from primordial circumstances in which you have weakness, poverty, universal barbarism, and up to the greatness of Sparta and Athens. But we also have to remember that that story, that logos of the rise of the greatness of Greekness from universal barbarism is occasioned in the very opening paragraph by not simply the greatest war of the Greeks up to that point, but in fact the greatest motion of not just the Greeks, but as Thucydides says, the whole of mankind. And we can never forget that logos is given to us by Thucydides, who in that opening line explicitly says he is an Athenian. In other words, true knowledge of the imperfect beginnings of Greekness into the subsequent greatness of Greekness is somehow made possible by Athens. And of course, from the previous discussion, we already know that what most characterizes Athens is its innovation, its techne, its technology. And as we're going to see shortly in Thucydides' turn to speeches, that precondition, which is to say the Athenian daring of innovation away from its beginnings, is the precondition for true knowledge and true power. That's how Thucydides understands that he's able to provide us this entire text. And so what we have by re-examining the role of the poets, and Homer in particular, in the archaeology, is what we could call the dual or the double aspect of the entirety of the archaeology itself. And what I mean by that is this. In the opening paragraph, Thucydides very explicitly identifies himself as an Athenian. And what we found through meticulously examining the whole of the archaeology is that Athens is most especially on the side of innovation, of techne, and that's to say of motion. The rise of the greatness of Greekness is most exemplified by the techne of harnessing motion. But at the same time, motion is itself most destructive of the human things, as exemplified by the Peloponnesian War itself. And so while the archaeology is itself the story of the rise of the greatness of Greekness, which is to say progress from bad beginnings, it's also at the same time the story of the death of that progress from bad beginnings. And so it's in that way that we can say that the overall teaching of the archaeology, as prefigured in miniature form through the question of poetry, which is to say Homer, is the enormous tension between, on the one hand, war, motion or unrest, poverty and injustice, and on the other hand, peace, rest, wealth, and right or justice. And it's worth emphasizing the role of justice there, because if the origins or the beginnings are good, which is to say they're healthy, then one doesn't require techne, or we could say innovation or progress, because the old is the good. It doesn't require deliberation. It's already known. In other words, knowledge of the old, which is the good, which is just, doesn't require the deliberation made possible by the rest from motion established through the cities made by men. But if the origins or the beginnings are themselves imperfect, then at least initially and perhaps perpetually, self-preservation and knowledge of necessity are privileged over justice, if not in fact said to be justice. And so what we have with classical Athens, which is to say Periclean Athens, are two fundamental alternatives. On the one hand, you have Thucydides, and on the other hand, you have Plato and Aristotle. And it's precisely this that gets us to the deepest thought of none other than Friedrich Nietzsche. Now that, of course, is a separate series that I'm doing, but it's crucial for us to be aware of why these things are so incredibly relevant for us today. But that being said, this overall teaching of the archaeology, which Thucydides has aligned himself with, namely the blaming of the ancients as weak and the praise of the techne, or we could say the innovation, the progress of the moderns, gets us directly to the topic of this discussion, because it's also none other than Pericles who's also going to have blame of the ancients for their weakness and praise of the techne, the innovation, the progress of the moderns. But I need to be perfectly clear. I'm not saying that Thucydides is aligning himself with Pericles. That's not the direction we're going in. All I'm saying is that textually, at least, we have these similarities of their thought which invite comparison. And so with all of that said, now let's pick up at the end of the archaeology so that we can see how it's going to segue directly into all of these apparent references to Pericles that I've been mentioning. So we're in Book 1, paragraph 21, and this is what Thucydides says. From the evidence I have presented, one would not go wrong in supposing that events were very much as I have set them out, and no one should prefer rather to believe the songs of the poets who exaggerate things for artistic purposes, or the writings of the chroniclers, which are composed more to make for good listening than to represent the truth, being impossible to check, and having most of them won a place over time in the imaginary realm of fables. Okay, and so Thucydides clearly has in mind Homer here, but he also is including what would seem to be Herodotus, a chronicler. And ultimately at issue here is this power of convention, but not simply convention or tradition, but the way in which it is illusory. In other words, it's mere fables. And in contrast to such pleasing but illusory fables, what Thucydides is offering up is true knowledge, because it's true knowledge that makes one powerful. And that being said, Thucydides continues as follows. My findings, however, you can regard as derived from the clearest evidence available for material of this antiquity. And so Thucydides is ending the archaeology, which is to say the logos of the beginnings of Greekness, by underscoring again his critique of the poets, which most especially consists of a critique of Homer, and not just the poets, but all other chroniclers. And just to repeat, that critique consists in the fact that the ancients lacked true understanding. And because they lacked true understanding, they lacked the ability for techne, or innovation, which provides true power. So the ancients were weak, and the moderns, which is to say classical Athens, have true power. And what we could say alternatively is that because the ancients lacked true understanding, the poets, and Homer in particular, have not given us the truth. And so just continuing, in order to end that paragraph 21, Thucydides says, and so back to this war, men always think that the war they are engaged in at the moment is the greatest one ever. And then, when it's over, they're more impressed by earlier wars. Nevertheless, for those who look at the actual facts, this war will prove to be greater than all earlier wars. This is Thucydides' turn to speeches. And remember, the entirety of the archaeology was Thucydides speaking in his own name and providing assessments and judgments. The rest of the entire text, hundreds of pages, consists in 141 speeches from the various participants in the war, and Thucydides will say almost nothing except on a few rare and all-important occasions. Only then will he make an observation or express a judgment. So let me just read this paragraph, and then we'll get into why that turn, Thucydides' turn to speeches, is so incredibly important for understanding what this text, the Peloponnesian War from Thucydides, should be understood as. And so beginning in paragraph 22, this is what Thucydides says. As to what was said in speeches by the various parties, either before they went to war or during the conflict itself, it was difficult for me to recall the precise details in the case of those I heard myself, just as it was for those who reported back to me on cases elsewhere. What I have set down, in other words, what Thucydides is providing here in the text, is how I think each of them would have expressed what was most appropriate in the particular circumstances, while staying as close as possible to the overall intention of what was actually said. However, as to the events of the war themselves, I resolved not to rely in my writing on what I learned from chance sources or even on my own impressions, but both in the cases where I was present myself and in those where I depended on others, I investigated every detail with the utmost concern for accuracy. Okay, we're at a full stop moment, because what Thucydides has just told us is that there is a fundamental twofold distinction in this work. On the one hand, you have the speeches, and on the other hand, you have the events or the deeds, and that distinction is going to be definitive. But before I elaborate further on that distinction, let me go ahead and finish the paragraph because he's going to tell us even more. Continuing, he says, "This was a laborious process of research, because eyewitnesses at the various events reported the same things differently, depending upon which side they favored and the power of their memory. Now, perhaps the absence of the element of fable in my work may make it seem less easy on the ear, but it will have served its purpose well enough if it is judged useful by those who want to have a clear view of what happened in the past, and, the human condition being what it is, what can be expected to happen again sometime in the future in similar or much the same ways. It is composed to be a possession for all time, and not just a performance piece for the moment." All right, so very much to unpack from all that, so let's get started. To begin with, Thucydides tells us he's not providing what the poets provide, nor the chroniclers. And this is because the great problem is that what is believed to be true is that which is spoken most eloquently and most immediately pleasing. And what Thucydides is telling us is that the long tradition of that which is accepted and taken to be most eloquently stated and most immediately pleasing is not true. And in fact, that is compounded enormously by something that Thucydides has already told us at the end of section 20. In other words, at the end of the archaeology. There, he ended the archaeology by saying the following: "So little trouble do people take to search out the truth, and so readily do they accept what first comes to hand." Now, Hobbes famously translated Thucydides as well, and I actually like Hobbes' translation better, especially on that particular line, because the way Hobbes translates it is this: "So impatient of labor are the majority of men in the search for truth, they embrace soonest the things that are right at hand." So we can say that for Thucydides, there are three fundamental problems that constitute man's relationship to the truth. First, man seems to presuppose that that which is true is easily available, it's not very far out of reach, and when that truth is put into speech, it's very beautiful in the sense of being eloquent, and therefore very pleasing, if not the most pleasing of things. And second, most men are simply lazy, and they're most especially lazy if work is required in order to know the truth of things. And third, most men are simply too quick in drawing conclusions. In other words, most men are simply hasty, and that hastiness is building upon laziness. And so most men hastily draw conclusions from lazily obtained information. We could say from lazily obtained premises or lazily obtained hearsay. And so because of all of that, Thucydides is not going to speak like the poets. He's not going to speak really like anyone else. And the reason for that is because everyone else has been wrong. This gets us back to why it was that Thucydides explicitly identifies himself as an Athenian, namely because progress has been made in knowledge of the truth of things, and most especially in the Greekness of Athenian innovation. In other words, according to Thucydides, the progress in mind that is the greatness of Greekness is most represented in Athens. And so this is to say that Thucydides has knowledge of the truth of things precisely because he is an Athenian. And when that progress in knowledge is placed in speech, the speech is itself fundamentally different than all prior speeches which claimed to best represent the truth. And what a difference it is, because Thucydides' claim is that the deeds or the events are more important than the speeches. In other words, the deeds or the events are primary. In fact, they condition the speeches. And what this means is that the political, not the private, is primary. In other words, politics shapes the character of human beings in the most fundamental, which is to say the most decisive sense. And once again, this gets us back to why it is the case that Thucydides identifies himself as an Athenian. Namely, Thucydides is able to see and understand the truth of things precisely because he has been shaped by Athens, not any other Greek polis. And we can never emphasize enough that what is most characteristic of Athens is their innovation, their techne or craftsmanship, and its superior progress through Athenian daring. Let's belabor this for a moment because the rest of the entire text, which is to say a couple hundred pages, is Thucydides providing speeches. And he's just told us that the speeches come close to what was said, but they could not possibly be exact. But his speeches that he provides, as he tells us, have a twofold characteristic. On the one hand, they are as close or exact as possible to what was said. Or, and this is crucial, he says that they are what he thought needed to be said in the particular circumstance. Or as he says, how it seemed to me to need to be said. But throughout the rest of the entirety of the text, which is 141 speeches, Thucydides never tells us whether or not what he's providing is a speech that he remembered and came as close or exact as possible to what was truly said, versus what he, Thucydides, thought needed to be said. So the speeches are either reconstructed or they are entirely constructed. And I'm using that word very specifically precisely because this notion of construction we could think of as the absolute highest form or the most perfect form of innovation or techne, which is to say craftsmanship. And all of that is going to be especially important for us when we consider Pericles' funeral oration speech, because we don't know if Thucydides is reconstructing it or constructing it wholesale, which is to say that we don't know if Thucydides is reporting it as best as he could remember, or if it's an outright construction of what Thucydides thought was needed to be said in order for us to best understand Pericles. But whereas the speeches have a fundamentally inherent ambiguity to them, Thucydides tells us that the deeds or the events, they're much more exact. In other words, because the deed or the event is prior to the speech, the deed or the event speaks for itself. And specifically, what he told us was that as to the deeds or the events of the war themselves, I resolved not to rely in my writing on what I learned from chance sources or even on my own impressions, but both in the cases where I was present myself and in those where I depended on others, I investigated every detail with the utmost concern for accuracy. Or as Hobbes translates it, and again, I really enjoy the Hobbes translation, he says, "But of the acts themselves done in the war, I thought not fit to write all that I heard from all authors, nor such as I myself did but think to be true, but only those where I was myself present, and those of which all diligence I had made particular inquiry." But in any case, what we see is that according to Thucydides, The relationship between the speeches and the deeds or the events is that the deeds or the events are somehow more reliable than the speeches, because the speeches have an inherent ambiguity because they of necessity are partial in at least that twofold way, being on the one hand that they're directed to a particular audience under specific circumstances, and they're spoken to that audience from a particular perspective, which is to say a political perspective. And this is so absolutely important for Thucydides that we could very well call it the Thucydidean principle, which is to say that speech is subordinate or even subservient to the deed or the event. That is the Thucydidean principle. And so let me clarify why that is so absolutely important. For speech to be subordinate to the deed or the event means that the condition, or we could say the precondition, of speech is the deed or the event. And when it comes to the human things, the most important deed or event is the polis. And so we can say that speech is fundamentally conditioned by or fundamentally depends upon the political order. And so all speech is political in the sense of being partial in at least two ways. All speeches address a very particular audience and circumstance. And in addressing a particular audience and circumstance, a particular, which is to say a political view, is taken by the speaker. And all of this is simply to say that speeches have an essential element of ambiguity in them. And in terms of politics, what this means is that the polis is always prior to he who is giving the speech. And keep in mind, I'm simply speaking in the voice of the Thucydidean perspective here. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with it. I'm simply presenting that perspective. And so just continuing, we can see just how radical that claim of the primacy of the political to speech and ultimately philosophy is in comparison to the other alternative to Thucydides, which is to say, again, Plato and Aristotle, and their so-called best cities in speech. Consider, for instance, Plato's Republic. If the deed or the event, and in the grand scheme of things, which is to say the polis, is prior to the speech, what that means is that there's no exiting the cave. In other words, the polis makes possible or impossible philosophy itself, according to Thucydides, in contrast to the Platonic or the Aristotelian tradition. Because in both Plato and Aristotle, the possibility of philosophy is dependent upon the individual soul, and whether or not that individual soul is philosophic in nature. But here we have to be very careful, and the reason for that is that in the Republic, Plato's Socrates is explicitly clear on the point that the city they are founding in speech is emphatically not one that can be founded in deed or act. In other words, they're looking towards perfect conditions that they know cannot arise under human conditions. In other words, they're looking towards perfect justice, knowing full well that perfect justice in this life is not possible. But that gets us to the heart of the very purpose of why the construction of best cities in speech is so important for Plato and Aristotle, and especially Plato, because he at least seems to be more concerned with politics throughout the entirety of his corpus than Aristotle is. But in either case, the problem is that we do not know what is possible. And so the construction of best cities in speech is so important for Plato and Aristotle, because in doing so, we're able to determine possible contradictions or even outright impossibilities that arise when we try to combine the various perfections that we so desperately want to have in this life, which is to say to make possible, to bring about in politics. In other words, the speech of the best city precedes the act or the deed of founding the best city. And we're seeing in Thucydides that that is exactly not what is possible, which is to say that it is the act or the deed of founding that precedes the speech of the act or the deed of the founding. And so what this means for Thucydides is that the fact of Athens makes possible the speech of Athens. In other words, the fact of Athens so thoroughly conditions the speech of the various citizens of Athens that to believe any particular citizen of Athens could understand himself as so objectively distant from Athens in order to step out of it and to construct the coming into being of Athens, much less any other kind of potentially better city, is to thoroughly misunderstand the power of the city and its conditioning of the citizens that it produces. And so Socrates and Plato were just as much conditioned by Athens as Thucydides understands himself to be. At least that's the claim of Thucydides, in contrast to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And just as a sidebar for the relevance of these alternatives between, on the one hand, Plato and Aristotle, and on the other hand, Thucydides, with respect to the possibility of constructing best cities in speech, we can see how the urgency for a deeper understanding on the issue arises in contemporary debates in Christianity, whether it's the Christian nationalist movement on the Protestant side, who in various ways argue that the Protestant discovery and establishment of America by the 15th and 16th century English Protestant settlers is no different, at least in no fundamentally significant way different, than the late 18th century revolutionary generation of the founders and the framers of American independence from England by way of the Constitution. Or on the other hand, the so-called Charlemagne option, of what's referred to by its proponents as Catholic integralism, which is to say Petrine supremacy, the supremacy of the doctrine of Peter, through which it is argued that the essence of a Roman Catholic imperialism is the same as the essence of Roman imperialism. Or in other words, to understand oneself politically as a Roman Catholic is the same as to understand oneself politically as a Roman from imperial Rome. In either case, Christian nationalism or Catholic integralism, the philosophical issue of the possibility of constructing best cities in speech is at the foundation of both sides, because the issue is whether or not the fact of modern America, which is to say, the fact of the modern institutions of governance, have already so thoroughly conditioned us such that we fool ourselves in thinking that we can stand outside of them and construct wholesale alternatives in speech to them that are not fundamentally conditioned by, which is to say limited by, those institutions and their preconditions. And so, for instance, let's take the fact of the separation of church and state as an example of something that very well may have limited or conditioned us so thoroughly that we don't even realize any of our various Christian constructions in speech as alternatives to it are in fact derivative of it, in which we don't even recognize. And so, for instance, consider the fact that we have trial by jury. We owe that to Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, which the founders cited more than any other modern text, including anything by John Locke. And that fundamental feature of American freedom was explicitly premised by Montesquieu on the elimination of the Christian version of trial by ordeal, where the ordeal would consist of something like getting thrown into an ice-cold river, and if you survived, then God had decreed that you were innocent. Or having your arm put in boiling water, and if you survived the wound, then again, God had decreed that you were innocent. Montesquieu's trial by jury, which the founders and the framers of America by way of the Constitution thought was absolutely crucial to our understanding of law, Montesquieu's trial by jury explicitly replaces that long-standing Christian tradition. And that's just one example of what the separation of church and state looks like, which we very often fail to even recognize because we are so thoroughly conditioned, which is to say limited, in our way of thinking about it. All of that and innumerable other examples of things like that are at issue, which is to say they come tumbling out of whether one sides with Thucydides or the tradition that comes from Plato and Aristotle with respect to the possibility of the construction of best cities in speech versus their impossibility in the thought of Thucydides, or because of their reliance upon various understandings of human progress, any number of philosophies of history, which is to say any number of various versions of historicism, which make the possibility of standing outside of one's time in any significant way simply not possible. That's how significant this question is of whether or not the fact of the act or the deed precedes or conditions the speech of the act or the deed, or vice versa, whether or not the speech of the act or the deed can precede and therefore itself condition or determine the act or the deed. And is that possibility of the best city in speech conditioning or determining the act or the deed, which takes us out of the construction of the best city in speech in Plato's Republic and into Plato's longest dialogue, the Laws. Because as we're about to see, the ability of the construction of the best city in speech to supplement the act or the deed of founding is the key to understanding the drama which orients the entirety of the Logos in the Laws. And I want to belabor this just a little bit. On the one hand, because I'm doing an entire series on Plato's dialogue, the Laws, but also, and more important for our purposes here, the city that they are founding in speech in the Laws is understood to be one that might possibly be founded in deed or act. But as I'm going to explain right now, it turns out that even under those circumstances, the possibility for philosophy is the same as in the Republic. And for our purposes here, remember what that means is that the speech is prior to the deed or the act. The dialogue itself only has 3 interlocutors, 3 characters, and they're all old men representative of the cities from which they have traveled to Crete. You have the Athenian stranger, who somehow is and is not Socrates. Then you have Clinias, a Cretan. And lastly, you have Megillus, a Spartan. And at the end of Book 3, Clinias reveals that he has been tasked, along with 9 other people, to, as he says, discover some laws from elsewhere that appear to be better, regardless of how foreign or strange those laws are, for what is in fact going to be a city that gets founded, a colony of Crete. And he says to the Athenian stranger, so now let's do ourselves, me and you two as well, this favor, making a selection from the things that have been said, let's construct a city in speech, just as if we were founding it from the very beginning. That way, there will be an examination of the subject we're inquiring into, while at the same time, I, Clinias, may perhaps make use of this construction, in other words, the city in speech, in that city that is going to be founded. Okay, full stop. That right there, what Megillus has just said, is the most powerful statement in all of Plato regarding why it is that constructing cities in speech is so philosophically, which is to also say politically philosophically, important. And that's to say, for why it is that the primacy of speech to the act or the deed is so incredibly important in Plato and Aristotle. Specifically, if it is to be the case that philosophy and political philosophy are to be practical at all, then they simply have to be prior to the political in order, as Megillus has just said, to supplement the founders and legislators of political community in their activity of founding or legislating. Because if philosophy and political philosophy are only possible after the fact of the deed or the act, then they are fundamentally incapable of supplementing the founders and the legislators in their founding and their legislating. In other words, their founding and their legislating will be primarily driven by chance, and such founding or legislating can only be properly understood after the fact. That gets us to the heart of Hegel's very famous claim that the owl of Minerva, in other words, philosophy, only takes flight at dusk. In other words, philosophy is only possible after the fact. And it's precisely that that makes Hegel such a profound historicist, which is to say, no one is free enough from the era in which they live to stand outside of it in what we would think of as an objective or neutral way in order to properly assess it and correct it to right the ship of state before the ship of state founders on the rocks. And we have to understand that Hegel is by no means alone in this assessment, because as different as they are from Hegel, it's none other than Nietzsche and Heidegger who are going to take such a position regarding the ability of speech to accomplish really anything and radicalize it to its extreme, making the possibility of speech, and in fact mind itself, wholly dependent on either the chance occurrence that one is simply born with the appropriate, which is to say the proper instincts for commanding and legislating other men, or, in the case of Heidegger, being entirely dependent upon entirely inexplicable revelations of insight in order to even know what is possible within one's own era. And this is the moment in the history of philosophy when history itself is replaced by what are called worldviews, where the world from which one views everyone and everything else, and in which that world is entirely a construct dependent upon the particular person. As Heidegger says in Being and Time, Dasein, in other words, the being of oneself that is thrown into an infinite number of possible worlds, itself worlds. In other words, world itself is no longer a noun. In fact, it's a verb. In any case, that being said about what Meticulous is going to do with their construction of the best city in speech, then in Book 4, after the Athenian stranger has explained the various kinds of regimes and the problems that they all face in coming into being, which is to say, in founding them, he says, let these remarks be like a myth pronounced in oracular fashion, revealing on the one hand that it would be difficult for a city with good laws to come into being, but on the other hand, that if what we discussed did occur, such a city's origin would be the quickest and by far the easiest of all. Now he's referring there to what he had just spoken of regarding what we could think of as an enlightened tyrant. But the more important point is that Clinias says, how can we do that? And the Athenian stranger's response is definitive. He says, let's try to harmonize this. In other words, what he had just spoken about regarding the regimes and a tyrant. He says, let's try to harmonize this with your city. And like elderly children, let's try to fashion the laws in speech. And he's been so persuasive with Clinias that Clinias is on the edge of his seat. And he says, yes, let's get on with it and not delay anymore. And the Athenian stranger says the following. He says, let us invoke a god in the setting up of the city. Let him, in other words, the god, hear us, and having heard, let him graciously and propitiously come to us and take part with us in the ordering of the city and the laws. And what's so significant about that is that the Athenian stranger has just given a kind of Cliff Notes version of political philosophy to Clinias. Then he says they need to invoke this god, and he then immediately begins to go further into what we would think of as more political philosophy. And now what's funny about this is that nowhere has the Athenian stranger said anything about this god. In other words, the god is entirely unknown. In fact, immediately, Clinias asked the Athenian stranger, who is this god? And rather hilariously, the Athenian stranger does not give him an obvious answer. He simply refers to Kronos. In other words, he points all the way back to the Titans. And he says that under the rule of Kronos, that's what we should imitate. More specifically, what he says is that the best arrangements at the present time is in fact an imitation of this. And the antecedent there of this is what he had just mentioned with reference to Kronos, namely, the god who truly rules as despot over those who possess intellect. And what's particularly fascinating about that is the Greek word for intellect there is nous. And the Athenian stranger makes much of that word nous. In fact, he's going to say subsequently that those lacking nous should not even pray, because it's questionable if they even know what is good to pray for, because in the absence of nous, mind, intellect, the Athenian stranger says that those lacking nous don't even know what to pray for, and so very possibly they're praying for the wrong things. And just to be specific, this occurs in Book 3, and the way that the Athenian stranger phrases it is in terms of fathers and sons. He's speaking directly to Meticulous, and this is what he says. Presumably, we would also join with our friends, at any rate, in praying that they might have the things they wish for themselves. Meticulous agrees and says, of course. The Athenian stranger responds, a son is a friend of a father, though one is a child and the other is a man. Meticulous says, how could it be otherwise? And then the Athenian stranger responds with, yet many of the things a child prays for, he will get, and a father would pray the gods never to allow in accordance with the son's prayers. And Meticulous responds, you mean when the son who prays lacks intelligence, the Greek word there is nous, and is still young? And the Athenian stranger answers with, and also when the father, either because he is an old man or all too much still a youth, knows nothing of what is noble and just, and experiencing passions akin to those of Theseus against Hippolytus, who died so unfortunately, prays with a vehement passion, vehement pathimos, do you suppose that the son will echo his father's prayer? And Megillus responds by saying, I think I understand what you mean. You're saying that one shouldn't pray or to be eager to have everything follow his own wish, but rather that his wish follow or be guided by his prudence, his phronesis. And the Athenian stranger responds with, yes, and also that the man who is a statesman lawgiver must always look to this, in other words, the things that we wish for to follow phronesis, prudence, in setting up the orderings of the laws. And here it's also worth noting that Aristotle follows Plato's lead here in the Nicomachean Ethics, and specifically in the opening of Book 5, Aristotle says the following: since the unjust person grasps for more, the Greek word there is pleonexia, and that's an extremely important word in Plato's laws, and more generally in all of Plato. But since the unjust person grasps for more, he will be concerned with the good things, not all good things, but so many good things fortune and misfortune concern, which are those that are always good unqualifiedly, but not always good for a particular person. Yet human beings pray for and pursue these things, though they ought not. Rather, they ought to pray that the things that are good unqualifiedly be good also for them, and they ought to choose the things that are good for them in fact. And just as importantly, because it goes hand in hand with this, the Athenian stranger is going to pun on the word nous and the word nomos. And that's to say that he's going to pun on the word for mind or intellect and the word for law. And what he's going to say is that our laws, our nomoi, are striving to become mind or intellect, nous. And so the status of, on the one hand, the divine, and on the other hand, human mind or intellect, nous, becomes blurred. And that's to say that when the presence of the divine is not immediately clear, philosophy imposes itself in order to carry what's missing. And not simply philosophy, but political philosophy. And the distinction here is very important because it's made explicit throughout the Platonic dialogues. And we see this in Aristotle as well. And what I mean is the following. On numerous occasions, Plato's Socrates draws a very sharp distinction between the philosophical virtues and the political virtues, where the philosophical virtues are concerned only with the virtue, in other words, the excellence of man as man, and the political virtues are concerned only with the excellence of man as citizen, which is to say, of man in political community that is to flourish, because it's not at all clear that the pursuit of virtue, in other words, the excellence of man as man, is at the same time conducive to the virtue, the excellence of man in political community. Think of it this way. What would a political community look like that was entirely peopled by a bunch of Socrateses? And similarly, in Aristotle, the way he phrases this is under what conditions would the good man also be a good citizen? And so what all of this means for Plato and Aristotle is that when it's not immediately clear what the divine is, or what would constitute piety towards the divine, the philosopher, as political philosopher, strides onto the stage and makes prayer subservient to mind, intellect, nous. And the Athenian stranger has already made great emphasis upon precisely that back in Book 1, in which he's going to further emphasize in Book 7 by way of the all-important imagery he uses of man as a divine puppet. And the way that he initially did this back in Book 1 was he said, let's consider each of us living beings to be a divine puppet put together either for their play, in other words, for the play of the gods, or for some serious purpose which we don't know. And the doubling down of that rather amazing statement occurs in Book 7 when the Athenian stranger says, Of course, the affairs of human beings are not worthy of great seriousness, yet it is necessary to be serious about them, and this is not a fortunate thing. And then, in clarifying what he says is worthy of seriousness and what is not worthy of seriousness, the Athenian stranger says the following: "This is the way our nurslings should consider things. They should believe that what's been said has been adequately spoken, but that the demon and God will suggest things to them regarding sacrifices and choral performances, thus indicating those to whom they should offer games and propitiate, and when they should play each game for each, so as to live out their lives in accordance with the way of nature, being puppets for the most part, but sharing in small portions of truth." So man is a divine puppet. Now that can be interpreted in at least two ways. It can mean possession, in other words, man belongs to the divine as the puppet of the divine. Or it could mean that there's something divine about man in his puppeting or imitation of the divine. And here it's important that we be aware of where exactly in Plato the best example of such puppetry of the divine by man occurs. It's in the Republic, and it's in none other than the famous imagery of the cave. And here we have to be aware that in Greek, the word for puppet is the same as the word for wonder, thauma. And so a puppet is quite literally a wonder. And it's in both Plato and Aristotle that it is explicitly said that philosophy begins in wonder. And what we're told by Plato's Socrates in the Republic immediately about the imagery of the cave is that all the prisoners of the cave, in other words, all of us, are fooled by what we see projected onto the wall of the cave as shadows of puppets, in other words, of wonders, that are manipulated by puppeteers who are behind all of the prisoners. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that in Greek, the word for puppeteer is a puppet maker, where the word puppet, again, is the same as the word for wonder, thauma. And the maker part of the word is none other than poesis. And so all of the prisoners of the cave, in other words, us, we are manipulated by wonder poets, poets of wonder. They create, they construct wonder. But in either case, philosophy seems to stride onto the stage when it seems to be the case that those things which man considers of the greatest significance for his life are merely a kind of play acting. And we could go even further and say that once philosophy has acted as a kind of acid bath to those things which man considers most sacred, the need for political philosophy becomes absolutely urgent. And that's exactly what's going on with, on the one hand, the fact that those lacking mind or intellect should not be allowed to pray because they probably don't know what to even pray for. And on the other hand, the way that law, nomos, has to strive to imitate mind or intellect, nous. That's political philosophy. Or perhaps better stated, we could say that's Platonic political philosophy. And there is so very much that comes tumbling out of just that. But again, that's for my series on Plato's laws. But what is significant for us here is that by the invocation of this unknown and possibly even unknowable God, they are then able to establish or found a city and speech that they are attempting to reconcile or harmonize with the city that Clinias is going to be a part of founding. And so what that means is that, again, speech or logos is prior to the deed or the event. And just to emphasize again, that is absolutely not what we have in Thucydides. For Thucydides, it is in fact inverted. And so whereas in Plato, the possibility of philosophy is independent from, because it is prior to, the city or the polis, what we are witnessing in Thucydides is that that is not the case. It is in fact the inverse, because what we would think of as the private or the individual is so thoroughly conditioned by the political. And here we have to make sure that we understand something that's extremely definitive. If it is the case that the fact of the political conditions, fundamentally determines the possibility of philosophy, which here in our case is correlate with the possibility of the construction of best cities in speech prior to the political. And so if the fact of the political is the precondition for philosophy, then what that means is that the intelligibility of the coming into being of the political is not of necessity rational, which is to say that it might fundamentally be just a matter of mere chance. And so insofar as the political is determined by the laws that are established, then the political as such is not of necessity rational. And this is to say that it's not of necessity natural, in the sense of the natural being that which we begin with in attempting to discern intelligibility. And it's in my recording on Aristotle and Heidegger in the Technology and Nihilism series, where I go into very meticulous detail about what exactly this means with regard to the word nature, physis. It's the word we get our word physics from. But that being said, what this means more broadly for our purposes here is that in Thucydides, there is not of necessity a supervening, rational or natural law that establishes and sustains the political. In other words, there's not of necessity any kind of cosmic or divine support in the affairs of man. Now we're going to see this on spectacular display once we get to Pericles' funeral oration, where Athenian daring shows itself in its most hubristic way as Pericles' assertion that they, the Athenians, don't even need the divine. Now that's not at all to say that Thucydides agrees with Pericles on that point. In fact, it's going to turn out that it seems to be the case that the deepest teaching of Thucydides is that he disagrees with Pericles on this point. But as any deep thinker, Thucydides is very subtle on this, because that is not to say that he disagrees with Pericles on not even believing in the divine. And this is another point in which we see the alternative of Plato and Aristotle showing itself, because the first occurrence of that phrase, natural law, is from the dialogues of Plato. In fact, the Athenian stranger very early in the laws invokes natural law in his opposition to homosexuality. But the status of natural law in Plato's laws is itself uncertain, because much later on, in fact, in the so-called theology of the laws, precisely where we would expect the Athenian stranger to re-invoke natural law, he's entirely silent on it. And that silence, in many ways, is deafening. And even more problematic is that in Plato's Gorgias, the invocation of natural law, it comes from none other than Callicles, who makes the case that the only natural law is that might makes right. And in responding to Callicles on this point, Plato's Socrates does not invoke natural law. Rather, he says the following: I set these things down in this way, and I claim that they're true. And if they are true, it looks like the things someone who wants to be happy needs to pursue and make a practice of is moderation. And the things each of us needs to run from as fast as his feet can go is self-indulgence. At best, one needs to manage things so as to have no need for discipline to be imposed. But if he himself or any other private person close to him or his city does need it to be imposed, then a just penalty needs to be enforced and discipline needs to be imposed if they're going to be happy. And this seems to me to be the target one ought to live with his eyes on, bending all his own efforts and those of his city toward acting in such a way that justice and moderation will be present for a person who's going to be blessedly happy, and not towards letting his desires be undisciplined and trying to give each of them their fill, because living the life of a plunderer is a trouble that has no end. For that sort of person would not be dearly loved by any other human being or God, since he's incapable of sharing anything, and where no single thing is shared, there can be no friendship. And those who are wise Callicles, they declare that heaven and earth and gods and humans are held together by the shared bond of friendship and by orderliness, moderation, and justice. And it's for this reason, Callicles, that they call this whole, in other words, that they call the totality of the collection of friendship, orderliness, moderation, and justice, a cosmos, and not a disorder or a dissipation. In other words, they call the collection of those things a cosmos and not a chaos. And so notice what Socrates has said there. He said, if all of that is true, so it's all in the subjunctive. And while Socrates himself says that he believes it's true, the fact that he presents it in the subjunctive, in other words, as hypothetical, means that it very well may not be the case. But the point that he takes it to be true, while nonetheless hypothetical, means that he, Socrates, does not have a logos, a proof that it is not true. And notice what else? Compounding that is Socrates' lack of knowledge to prove that it is true. Because notice that Socrates did not include himself among those, which is to say, the wise, who, as he says, declare that the whole, in other words, the heaven and earth and gods and men, are held together in that bond of friendship, orderliness, moderation, and justice. And so what we can say is that by Socrates not including himself and instead deferring to the wise, Socrates is in fact deferring to what we would think of as orthodoxy, which is to say tradition, convention. And while such deference is, of course, politically prudent, it's not at all immediately clear that it is philosophical, at least in the sense that Socrates understands the philosophical virtues as radically different than the political virtues. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the great divide between these alternatives of, on the one hand, Thucydides, and then on the other hand, Plato and Aristotle. Namely, that in Plato and Aristotle, there's a recognition of the subjunctive, in other words, the hypothetical status of cosmic or divine support for man, in conjunction with a very explicit, very clear, and we might also add, very alleged deference to what we would think of today as orthodoxy, which is to say the tradition, the convention of the divine. Whereas it does not seem to be the case in Thucydides that belief in the divine is justified. And so just to be very clear, in Plato and Aristotle, we find the recognition of the subjunctive nature, in other words, the hypothetical nature of the divine, while also, and we could say politically prudently, there is, at least allegedly, belief in the orthodox tradition within the polis of the divine. Whereas in Thucydides, the subjunctive nature of the divine can be found almost everywhere, and that's when it's not flat out being denied. And only very dimly does Thucydides seem to provide the at least politically prudent teaching of reverence toward the orthodox tradition within the polis of the divine. The most we're going to get in Thucydides is that he seems to be siding with how Sparta handled the divine in opposition to how his Athens, by way of Pericles, handled the divine. And easily among the most important ways that we can discern this from the text, and which I'm going to go into great detail here in this recording about, is a very careful, a very meticulous juxtaposition of Archidamus' speech in Sparta with Pericles' funeral oration speech. And so what we're going to see is just how distorting it is to think of Pericles' funeral oration speech in isolation from the speeches that preceded, and in particular from the speech of Archidamus. And in fact, the worst possible thing that one could do is think of Pericles' funeral oration speech as in any way encompassing of the overall teaching of Thucydides in the text. And just as an extremely important sidebar, we have to also consider this question. What does it mean for the deed or the event to be prior to the speech for a Christian? In fact, as we're going to see, that same question is applicable to the Athens of Thucydides, which is to say, to Periclean Athens. And so Athens is the condition for the Thucydidean speech, which is the entire text of the Peloponnesian War. And so as we continue, we're going to really need to keep an eye on the status of the divine in Athens. But there's also a deep perplexity in all of this because Thucydides' speech is a speech. And so presumably it's also prone to the fact of being partial, but he claims that it's not. He's told us that his speech serves no other purpose than to reveal the truth about the Peloponnesian War. And so his claim is that his speech is at one with, is reconciled with, the deeds or the event, which is the Peloponnesian War. In other words, he's not going to magnify or make beautiful the deeds or the events. They're going to speak for themselves. However, again, the deeds or the events are simply not accessible except through speech. And the teaching that Thucydides has just given us about speeches is that they're always deceptive. And with regard to the poets or the chroniclers, the speeches are even means or instruments of deception. But notice that he's taken this into account, because what he has said is that all speeches, and in particular his speech, which is the text of the Peloponnesian War, is to be judged in the light of the deeds or the events. And it's that judgment on Thucydides' speech that he has in mind in claiming that his speech, in other words, the text of the Peloponnesian War, is a possession for all time. So just like earlier, as we saw in the archaeology, Thucydides is projecting himself into future generations and looking back with an eye towards the truth of things that the progress in Athens has made possible in him. And so what we can say is that the Thucydidean principle that speech is subordinate to the deed or the event is the true source of philosophy. Now, that's not to say that I'm trying to turn Thucydides into a philosopher. I'm certainly not. However, Thucydides is making a claim to the fundamental truth of things, and that certainly is within the purview of philosophy. And we can say that that's the greatest praise that Thucydides ever gives Athens. In other words, Athens has made possible the highest understanding. And we can state that even more strongly by saying that Athens is in fact the condition for universal understanding. But in saying that, we have to remember what Thucydides himself told us about his Athens, Periclean Athens, in the opening section of the text itself. Remember, both Athens and Sparta are at their peak, the Greek word there being acme, which is to say the highest point in their preparation for war. And what that means is that everything is downhill from there. And so Thucydides' Athens, which is to say Periclean Athens, or as we would say classical Athens, is the city of universal understanding, but only for so long, because it too, like everything else, perishes away. And that perishing away is the text, Thucydides' text, of the Peloponnesian War. And so in Thucydides, the political is primary. In other words, philosophy, even and especially political philosophy, is secondary to, which is to say is dependent upon, what gets established or founded through the political. And additionally, that which is established through politics is fragile. That's the meaning of the Thucydidean principle. And just as a sidebar, in both undergrad and graduate school, I was fortunate enough to have two amazing professors of political philosophy who offered entire seminars on Thucydides. And one of them pointed out the following with regard to what we're referring to here as the Thucydidean principle, namely, that we can understand it in terms of William Butler Yeats's 1928 poem, The Tower, and in particular, part 2 of section 218. And this is what Yeats says: "Everything that man esteems endures a moment or a day. Love's pleasure drives his love away. The painter's brush consumes his dreams. The herald's cry, the soldier's tread, exhaust his glory and his might." And here's the crucial conclusion: "Whatever flames upon the night, man's own resinous heart has fed." In other words, man's own sticky and highly flammable, highly combustible heart has fed. And this connection to Yeats is also important because Yeats himself was fundamentally in dialogue with the teaching of Friedrich Nietzsche. And on numerous occasions, Nietzsche, in his published works, cites Thucydides as being the model, our model, for guidance as we're going forward. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that Thucydides be understood as a proto-Nietzschean, or in fact, any kind of Nietzschean. That's not what's going on. I'm simply providing a point of contact for the linking across millennia, as if they were mountain peaks, of the thought of a few great thinkers. But in any case, the primacy of the political And the fragility of that which it establishes only further emphasizes why it is that the role of techne, which is to say art, craftsmanship, technology, in Thucydides must be recognized and understood. And now that being said, just as an indication of what's to come once we get to Pericles' funeral oration speech, suffice it to say here that the Thucydidean principle, in other words, the relationship between speeches and the deeds or events that the speeches are supposed to clarify, the inherent ambiguity, the partiality of Pericles' speech, first and foremost, is that it serves to encourage the Athenians amid the loss of life of their people in the war itself. And Pericles himself is speaking about this as an Athenian, in other words, not a Spartan or any other Greek. And what we're going to find out is that not only is he speaking from the perspective of being himself an Athenian, but he's also of a particular political party in Athens. And as we're going to see, that's going to be extremely important, and it's going to reveal so very much that Thucydides himself keeps rather guarded, leaving it up for us, the reader, to see just how important it is. Because remember, it's always the deeds or the events that are primary and which the speeches themselves are in subservience to. And in saying that, what's lurking in the background is the question, to whom is the text addressed? In other words, for whom is Thucydides himself writing? Who does he want his readers to be? Who does he envision as his best readers? And that takes us back to the question of what exactly distinguishes Thucydides' speech from the speech of essentially everyone else. Because remember, he just told us his speech is fundamentally different from the poets and the chroniclers. And what Thucydides means by that is that his speech is not for the sake of the beautiful or the pleasant, which is to say that his speech is not for public competition. Rather, it's a private and useful speech, which, as he also said, is an everlasting possession. So we need to better understand what all that means in order to best understand the question, for whom is Thucydides writing? Who does Thucydides think is the best listener to his speech?